In March 2020, we saw some of the most terrifying images that we've seen in a long time. Exhausted medical staff, empty supermarket shelves, long queues at food banks. We saw suffering, pain, but also solidarity and creativity and hope. A whole new range of words came into our vocabulary, and some acquired completely different meanings. We were locked down, we heard about supply chains, PPE, working from home, homeschooling. We learned to distinguish ventilators from respirators, self-isolation from quarantine, bags from anti-bags. We zoomed, we teamed, we were zoomed out, we were teamed out, definitely teamed out. But what we here at the Global North, where we're standing today, so much less of, was what was happening at the other end of those supply chains we were so worried about. What was happening in those factories that were producing the clothes we were not buying, the electronic devices that we were buying. Those factories that were producing the gloves, the masks, the ventilators that our governments were so desperately trying to source to protect and save our lives. Images like thousands of workers crowded out at a bus station at the outskirts of New Delhi. Thousands of migrant workers trying to get home after whole supply chains had collapsed. Workers piled up in their factories, made to work extra hours to be able to comply with the surge in demand. Like the workers in Malaysia, in the factories, the same factories that were producing the gloves that our governments were sourcing for our hospitals. Like the workers in this factory that were bussed at night. Hundreds of workers after there was an outbreak in their factory for over 1,000 people in one day tested positive for COVID. But let's go back to words. And the title of my talk. These two words, two unthrilling words, which don't tend to grant a follow-up question when I say what I do for a living at dinner parties. These two words that actually, some of my colleagues, when they heard what my TEDx talk was going to be about, said, oh dear, good luck with that. Public procurement. What is public procurement? Public procurement is the buying of goods and services by the government. It's buying of goods, services, and work so the government can exercise their functions, provide services to the citizens. These unsexy words come with the everyday job of design a tender, upload a tender, grant a tender, sign a contract, execute a contract, terminate a contract. In principle, not very exciting. Not that most of our jobs are these days, just sitting at home, zooming and typing emails. But these two words represent a precious tool that public buyers have on their hands. Because public procurement moves money. It moves a lot of money. It represents 13 to 20% of GDPs of our governments. Governments spend in goods, services, and works $13 trillion a year. Imagine a buying power of $13 trillion a year. But also, during the pandemic, we've understood that public procurement can not only be a function of the state, it can be a life-saving function. Governments were buying the goods and services they needed to protect their citizens. So how does someone like me, a human rights lawyer, end up working on public procurement. I studied human rights because I wanted to make a difference. I studied human rights because I wanted to change the world, wanted to change people's lives. And in fact, this is what I tell my students every day. I tell them that you have the capacity to change the world and to make governments and corporations accountable. But as I was sitting in my office, I was feeling, all this emailing, writing pompous academic articles, reading even more pompous academic articles. Where does this lead me in terms of impact of my work? And this was when an organization called People and Planet, which is a student network that fights for environmental and social justice, approached me. And they asked me, how can we pressure universities to buy electronics goods, making sure that they're free from human rights abuses, that their suppliers do not benefit, do not profit from these atrocious working conditions in the supply chain? And I thought, well, I don't know. Can we legally ask suppliers to not benefit from human rights abuses? Normally, when I walked into an IT room in my university building, I see my students tapping away, trying to do these essays that that they're always late for. But I never thought, so what's behind this? What's behind the screen? Who makes these products and how? And how do we buy them? So this was when I started looking into this, and especially when, with colleagues, I worked to establish an organization called Electronics Watch, which is an organization that brings together public sector buyers in the West with monitoring organizations, with civil society organizations on the ground, on the producing countries, those countries where the workers are. These organizations which are the voice and the eyes and the ears of workers. But I'll tell you about Electronics Watch another day, because I have to go back to my two little words, my precious public procurement. Public procurement is about buying. It's about buying well. It's about buying cheap, or at least at the best price available for the quality and quantity that we need, and the speed that we need it. Public procurement is about non-discrimination, open competition, transparency. It's about making sure that public sector contracts are open to all bidders. And it's about efficiency and effectiveness. This is not spending 1 penny more than we need. At the end of the day, this is our money. It's taxpayers' money. But public procurement is not about being fair to those who produce those goods and services that we buy. It's not about making sure that the commercial activities of the public sector do not perpetuate situations of endless abuse in supply chains. It's not about who made the bricks or who laid the bricks that sustain this theater, which is paid in part with public money. This is not to say that public procurement has never cared about rights or social considerations. In fact, the first time that public procurement was used to address social injustices or inequalities was after the First World War. And again after the Second World War, to employ disabled veterans. Later on, it was used as part of the US civil rights movement to empower the Black population, to favor Black business owners to access government contracts. It's used to restructure the economy in a way that disadvantaged groups can access the economic activities. Women, indigenous people, Black and Asian minorities in the UK. In fact, in South Africa, it was used to redress the institutional inequalities and discrimination of the apartheid regime. The South African constitution is the only one that establishes that public procurement is not just about effectiveness, but also about equity. This is what Professor Christopher McCrudden, which is a pioneer, a scholar in the field, called buying social justice. But let's go back to March 2020. When we realized the dimension of the global health emergency we were facing, when we realized that governments needed to compete in the global market to get gloves, masks, apron, ventilators, medical equipment to furbish all these fast-surging hospitals that we were building. We didn't ask who were making these products. We didn't ask when, where, how. We wanted PPE, and we wanted it fast. But we knew, we've known for a very long time, we've known much before COVID, that surgical instruments made by children end up in our NHS hospitals. We know that public buildings serve seafood from Thailand that has been fished by boats that spend 3 years in the high seas without coming to shore, where migrant workers, Burmese migrant workers, are trapped without pay and without being able to put a foot back on land. We knew that uniforms were made in terrible conditions in factories like those in Bangladesh that collapsed after the Rana Plaza disaster, when over 1,300 people lost their lives, entangled in the textiles they were sewing, among which were found army fatigues for US military. We know about the cotton fields in Uzbekistan and China. We know how China uses the forced labor, especially in the cotton fields in Xinjiang province, to continue its program of crimes against humanity, against the Uyghur minority. Computers, servers, screens, all of them made in factories in China where the working conditions are so harsh that in 2010, it prompted dozens of suicides, people jumping from factories and dormitories, people that were exposed to long hours, minimal pay, hazardous working conditions, exposure to chemical substances that have the effect of provoking respiratory illnesses, cancers, and reproductive health harm to women, young women, the very young women that work in this industry. And you know what the response was to these suicides? No, it wasn't changing the working conditions. The factories placed safety nets outside the buildings so the jumpers wouldn't hit the ground. So what I'm proposing is that we use public procurement to address these violations. That we use public procurement not just as a purchasing tool, but as a social transformation tool. A tool that goes beyond our society, restructuring the inequalities in our society to address the inequalities beyond our borders, to those who are making our products. I believe governments have the power, the buying power, with our money to transform the economy, to drive responsible production and consumption practices in the market. I believe governments can use our money, not just to fulfill their human rights obligations, but also to go beyond and to protect the rights of those that are sitting in the factories like this one I'm standing at, without whom factories will be empty. And this is how a human rights lawyer ends up working in public procurement. This is how public procurement and human rights interrelate. This is how a human rights lawyer like me ends up working with an amazing bunch, a bunch of public buyers, a bunch that has the capacity to change the world as they purchase computers, tables, cleaning services, new buildings, uniforms. A bunch that is changing the world a tender at a time, and to whom I dedicate this talk today. Thank you very much.